One of our past videos, we got a question in the comment section. So figure we'll answer it because it actually something we just didn't think about. And if you do have any questions, TOTL@abyssheadphones.com. Just email us, TOTL. Anyway, the guy asks, let's say my headphones have a 5 hertz to 40 kilohertz frequency range. Would it be unwise to combine them with a 15 hertz to 25 kilohertz amp? And, at first you read that and it's like, I never really thought about the fact that we just take these things for granted.
Yeah,
You think about a low frequency, you see, basically these ratings are just the low frequency limit of the device and the high frequency limit of the device. It's fairly meaningless in between without more information, but that's kind of what it's telling you. But what he's saying is that how do I match up the frequency response of an amp, right, with the frequency response of a headphone?
Yeah.
And you kind of don't do it that way. So
it's kind of meaningless
to
do it that way.
Looking at what he's asking, I get how you could think
right.
that's the way to do it.
I get it, yeah. I never really thought of it like that.
Yeah, me neither, because we're just so accustomed to thinking about that.
So there's a few challenges
in a different
there.
way.
Pretty much what someone means as a manufacturer when they advertise a frequency response is it's either not designed or not particularly good above or below this range. Doesn't mean it doesn't do it. That's the difference. It could be that it rolls very sharply and there's very little sound emanated below or above that. Could be that case. Sometimes that's the way it is. Other times it's really not. And it's kind of a soft taper and they pick an arbitrary value because they feel, well, below this, there's modal breakup on the diaphragm, or it's just too quiet, or something of that nature.
Right.
But it doesn't mean there's a sharp cutoff where if you're half a hertz below that, it's dead, silent. It's not quite how it works. It's just they pick a value where they feel it's either too quiet, too distorted, too problematic to go above or below that.
Now that's typically with like a speaker or a headphone.
Yeah.
Now with amps, usually the specifications are
usually they're
fairly
closer.
accurate.
Yeah.
They usually give you, plus or minus so many dB, like minus 3 dB would be a good point.
But everyone kind of has their own little standards for that. There's kind of an industry best practice, but people measure it in different ways, and as a result, they come up with different numbers. So it's a little fickle there. You can't say in absolute terms that these numbers are dead on, but they're close. So if you're looking at it like an absolute number, you say, oh, I need to have a headphone amplifier that matches this. You don't. It's not quite how it works.
Yeah, it's not really the way it works.
And either way, you're always going to have a rate limiter, right? You're always going to have one thing that performs better than the other. Something's always going to limit it. It doesn't really make a big difference which one it is.
Well, especially in that given example, both are outside the range of human hearing,
right.
Both under 20 hertz and over 20 kilohertz.
Right.
So
yeah, so what does it really make a big difference?
Especially in a headphone, you're not going to hear 5 hertz,
Yeah, right.
So
yeah, the value below even like 40, 50 hertz, a lot of times with most music, is not that substantial. Not as much as people would think in headphones.
There's not as much music.
There's very little information there.
Yeah.
Well, it depends what you're listening to.
Well, that's true.
Sometimes there is.
The synthesized stuff, you can have all kinds of
But a lot of
information.
times it's really not as important as people think.
Yeah.
Especially you get into the really low numbers, 8 hertz, 10 hertz. Even if your amp doesn't do that, I wouldn't be too concerned. That's usually not a big factor.
But you'll notice it. But even then, like let's say that, you don't see this normally. Let's say the headphone rolls below 50 or 40, kind of like a bookshelf speaker would roll below 50 hertz, right? Let's pick on a small speaker. You're going to notice it doesn't have the bottom end. There's no question compared to a 4 standard that does 20. So yeah, there are differences, and I think a similar thing would occur with the headphones. But there shouldn't be a confusion. When you're matching an amplifier to a headphone, it's not about the frequency response, because for the most part, both are full enough range, to cover the human
well, especially
hearing.
modern amps, yeah.
Yeah, you're not really going to find an amp that's like, it doesn't go low enough to do bass, or it doesn't go high enough to hear the highs. So it doesn't really, if you made an amp like that, there's something wrong with it, basically.
Well, some amps will filter some of the low frequencies for various reasons, usually due to design. But generally speaking, it's not that big of a deal, except in some very limited circumstances.
So you're not really looking at that as an amplifier. You're looking at all the other factors, like does it have enough power for the headphone? How does it actually sound? Does the amplifier sound good on this particular speaker or headphone, and it's more of a mating ritual than it is looking at the frequency response.
Usually, all the other factors are oftentimes more important than the published frequency response. And now, that's not to say the frequency response doesn't matter. Of course it does. Wider is almost always better. If you could go lower and higher, that's usually better. But it doesn't necessarily mean that an amplifier that goes higher is better than one that doesn't. You got to consider how much it matters, how much of an impact that's going to have on your system, your headphone, your music. Because if one already goes to 35 kilohertz and one goes to 60, it doesn't make a big difference. You're not going to perceive a whole lot of impact.
Most people can't even hear to
pretty
20.
far outside.
Most people can't even hear near 20 kilohertz unless you're
even
unless you're
15.
young.
Yeah.
Yeah.
15, 16 is kind of the limit for most people.
I mean, if you're a kid, you could probably hear 20, 22 at 20, you know. But
Yeah.
once you get above probably
even in your
18,
20s,
20 years old,
starts fading.
Yeah, you'll probably lose a kilohertz a year or two. You know?
Well, I don't know about that.
You don't notice it
It's not
because
quite
it's a
that.
Well, that's
slow,
the thing.
gradual change, and
Yeah.
there's no information up there that really, you miss. In fact, it can be annoying to hear 20 kilohertz as you get older because there's
Yeah.
a lot of noises in life that just,
Old
give you a
tube
headache.
TVs.
yeah,
Is one of them.
yeah, 16 kilohertz. They got a 16 kilohertz
Yeah, those things screech.
hum to it. So anyway, yeah, the bottom line is that most people, I think it's probably part of us as being humans. There must be a reason why we roll over time. Maybe it would drive us nuts. Maybe it was just meant to be. Just as our parts age, that's
I
the
don't
way
know
it
about
goes.
that, but okay.
But maybe there's a reason for it. I don't know. I mean, what would happen if you could hear 20 kilohertz till you died?
Probably not a whole
I
lot.
think you'd have. I think as you get older, you get headaches. Personally, I think you're just more prone to headaches because of all the other things that goes on in life as you get older. It starts to build, and then now you have noise that's just constantly barraging your brain.
Yeah, it's a built-in problem solver.
It seems to be.
Yeah, a
You know?
filter. A
Yeah,
filter.
let's calm that part of the spectrum down as you get older, type thing. Which I think some people need more than others.
Well, I guess in speakers or headphones for that matter, yeah, the speaker or headphone itself, limitations are probably the bigger thing because if it can't actually produce that audio, it doesn't matter if the amp can make it or not.
Yeah, if
either.
the amp goes down to 5, but the speaker rolls below 50,
Yeah,
it
what's the
doesn't matter
difference?
what the amp's doing in the
You're
bass.
always limited by the weak link.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
And usually that's where the limits occur, is in the low frequency response. Almost any modern day speaker can do the high frequencies beyond audibility, beyond your, beyond where you're going to hear it. So the reality of it is usually you're going to concentrate more on the bass, and even then with headphone ratings, everybody goes lower than we go into these 5 hertz, 10 hertz range, which is you can't even hear it anyway.
Yeah, that's lower than you really need.
Yeah. So the reality of it is, with headphones in particular, I think, again, it's almost more about the sound of the headphone, the tonality of it, than it is about
bandwidth.
this simple rating. Yeah, this simple low frequency and high frequency extension. So
Well, for me, if I see something like a headphone or an amplifier that's rated 5 hertz to 35 kilohertz or something like that, which is somewhat typical, basically what that says to me is the frequency response is not a limitation for that
right.
product.
It goes lower than I can hear, and it goes higher than I can hear.
Right. So it's not a big
So
factor.
no worries
then.
there.
Yeah. So if one only goes to 7 and the other one goes to 5,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't worry about
But
that.
how does it sound?
Right.
Like that's the question. How
What does it cost? What does
if-
it look
if
like? How does
bo-
it work?
If both of the if all these headphones have similar specifications and they all go lower than you could hear and higher you can hear, they all still sound different.
Yeah. Right.
So now that's what you're more concentrating on, and then mating that to a proper amplifier. So yeah, that's kind of that's the confusion. I guess it's not a frequency response thing when it comes to matching up amps and
Well, you're just looking at the
Speakers.
extremes. What about everything in the middle?
yeah, there's a lot
You're
of stuff.
hearing the stuff in the middle.
Yeah,
you don't
right.
really
Yeah.
hear the end quite so much,
Yeah.
so it's not too big
Right.
of a factor.
Right.
And for most things, it's not like they just and that's straight down
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just less.
Yeah, they
usually.
roll off the top and bottom in all different ways,
Yeah.
Right.
depending on its design. Same with amplifiers too. They'll go lower and higher than their specifications. It's a question of how
Gets
they
a little
sound
quieter.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's right. It just gets quieter, right? You hear less of it as it goes lower and higher.
Right.
So
Usually not a
kinda
big deal.
drifts off into the distance.
Now, it could be a wall. Some things,
Yeah.
cut it hard at 20K or something, but
yeah, that requires a digital filtration. Yes.
but
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
most of the content you listen to isn't going to go above that anyways.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So
You know, like CD players are purposely, any of that stuff typically purposely cuts off at 20K. It just doesn't go above. There's nothing zero. Just brick wall filtering going on above that.
So basically, TLDR, it's not that important that they match up. Lower and higher is better, but not that critical. And usually the rate limiter is the headphone anyways. Especially with modern electronics, you could get very high or very low frequencies with an amplifier. Now, some are limited, but for the most part, they're outside of your hearing range enough that it doesn't have a big impact, and your music usually doesn't have a lot of energy there anyways. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. As long as it's not crazy narrow range, usually everything is pretty reasonable in the frequency response and the high end. I guess basically the predicament is, even if your headphone does 25 or 30 kilohertz and the amp does 45, 60 kilohertz, your ears might only do 17. So
yeah, the stuff's going
limited benefit there, right?
way beyond where you need to worry about it.
Yeah. One's always going to be the limit, and in a lot of cases, it's your hearing.
Yeah. And like I said, you know, if something's that limited in bandwidth, it's probably broken. You know, I mean,
Well, these days,
you
yeah.
don't make amplifiers that you know, unless they're
It's uncommon.
unless they're made to do that for like
Yeah.
Yeah, if you had
to
a
meet
reason.
THX specifications
Yeah.
to not go below 80 or something, right?
Yeah.
They don't make amplifiers that just drop, like, you know, roll at abnormal frequencies. That's the
Yeah.
whole idea of an audio amplifier, is it amplifies audio, amplifies what you're listening for.
You hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's not even the concern. It's other factors,
Yes.
and that, as they say, is that.
Yeah. As always, keep leaving comments if you have any questions, and we might answer them in a future episode. And you could also send us a question to totl@abyssheadphones.com. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.